Pastor Daniel Hayes, a man of faith, admired and trusted by an entire town. Rebecca Hayes, his beautiful wife, loved for her charm and grace. Martin Cole, the wealthy church owner whose generosity kept their ministry alive. Sarah Mitchell, the loyal trustee who uncovered a dark secret. And finally, the investigators, who would piece together the truth behind a crime that shocked everyone. Behind the stained glass windows of Willow Creek's beloved church, these names would collide in a story of love, betrayal, and murder. What began as whispers of an affair would end in blood, leaving an entire community asking, how could their pastor, the man they trusted most, become a killer? Pastor Daniel Hayes was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. In the small town of Willow Creek, people admired him for his calm voice, his steady presence, and his devotion to the church. Every Sunday, his sermons drew crowds that filled the wooden pews until there was no space left. His words carried warmth, and many claimed he had the rare ability to speak directly to the heart. By his side stood his wife, Rebecca Hayes, whose beauty and kindness made her just as beloved. Together, they gave the appearance of a couple chosen by God Himself. They were always seen hand in hand, smiling as though their lives were perfect, their marriage unshakable, their faith unbreakable. To the townspeople, Daniel and Rebecca were not just a pastor and his wife, they were a symbol of hope, the kind of love story that others wished to have. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks, and Willow Creek was a place where secrets did not stay buried for long. Rebecca was admired for her graceful nature, her elegance, and the way she made everyone feel welcome at the church. Yet beneath the glow of admiration, there were moments that seemed oddly out of place. Some would later recall that she often looked distracted, her gaze wandering toward the horizon as though she carried a burden no one could see. Others remembered her laughter, too light and too sudden, as if it were meant to disguise something deeper. But at the time, no one dared to question it. After all, who would suspect darkness lurking in the life of their most respected couple? Daniel himself felt the strain long before anyone else did. He noticed subtle changes, small shifts in Rebecca's behavior that he couldn't explain. The warmth in her touch seemed to cool, her presence at his side less constant. When he preached, he often searched the crowd for her eyes, looking for reassurance, but sometimes she wasn't there. When he asked, she always had reasons, errands, church duties, simple things that sounded believable enough. Still, the explanations left a trace of unease that Daniel pushed aside. His faith told him to trust, his love told him to forgive, but something else inside him whispered that not everything was as it seemed. Behind closed doors, their marriage wasn't quite the portrait everyone believed it to be. Rebecca was restless, often staying awake long after Daniel had gone to bed. The light from her phone screen flickered in the dark as she tapped quickly, then slid it under her pillow when Daniel stirred. He told himself it was nothing, a habit, a distraction. But deep down he wondered why she seemed so careful to hide her conversations. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with questions that Daniel never spoke aloud. He tried to bury his doubts with prayer, tried to convince himself that love could never betray him. But sometimes, late at night, he would watch her breathe beside him and feel the gnawing ache of uncertainty twisting in his chest. The town of Willow Creek adored Rebecca just as much as Daniel. People often spoke of her as though she were the true heart of the church. She organized gatherings, cared for the elderly, and made the children feel welcome. Yet while she appeared flawless to the public eye, Daniel could not shake the thought that something about her was slipping away from him. He felt it in the smallest details, the way she dressed more carefully for certain occasions, the way her smile seemed brighter around others, the way her attention was not always his. It was easy for the townspeople to believe in the illusion. They saw the couple on Sundays, standing together in the warm light of the stained glass windows. They saw them hosting dinners, greeting newcomers, living what appeared to be a perfect life. But they did not see the distance that had begun to grow behind their front door. They did not hear the quiet in the house where laughter used to echo. They did not witness the way Daniel's eyes followed Rebecca with suspicion. He could not admit, not even to himself, And so, the cracks deepened in silence, hidden beneath the image of faith and love. No one knew that beneath the surface of their admired marriage lay something fragile, waiting to shatter. No one guessed that the story of Pastor Daniel Hayes and his wife Rebecca would not be one of devotion, but one of betrayal and blood. For now, the town believed in perfection, but perfection is often the most convincing disguise of all, and Willow Creek was about to learn that even those who appear most righteous can harbor shadows darker than anyone could imagine. Martin Cole was a name that carried weight in Willow Creek. He was not a preacher, not a man of faith in the traditional sense, but his fortune had built the very foundation the church stood on. Long before Pastor Daniel Hayes became its shepherd, it was Martin who purchased the land, funded the construction, and ensured that the building gleamed brighter than any other structure in town. He was the silent benefactor, the man whose money spoke louder than sermons, though he never sought the spotlight. To many, Martin was a hero, a man who gave without asking for anything in return, but generosity often carries a price hidden in the shadows. Daniel admired Martin at first. He believed the church owner was a gift sent at the right time, someone who cared deeply about the mission of faith. Martin would sit in the front row every Sunday, dressed in expensive suits that seemed out of place among the modest congregation. His eyes never strayed from the pulpit, his attention fixed on Daniel as if the words held a personal weight. After service, he would shake hands with everyone, his charm undeniable, his smile practiced. Yet those who paid attention noticed that while Martin congratulated Daniel politely, his gaze often lingered elsewhere on Rebecca. It began subtly, in ways that no one thought twice about. Martin would compliment her for her role in organizing church events, send her flowers in the name of appreciation, or insist she accept donations to fund the programs she oversaw. Rebecca, always gracious, accepted the gestures with a smile. To others, it seemed harmless. But the frequency of Martin's presence raised quiet questions. Why did he attend not only Sunday service but also weekday gatherings, fundraisers and choir rehearsals where Rebecca played a role? Why was his generosity always tied to causes that placed him in her company? Daniel tried to dismiss these thoughts at first, convincing himself that Martin's involvement was simply loyalty to the church he had built. But the unease would not leave him. He remembered moments when Martin stood too close during conversations, or how Rebecca's laughter seemed fuller, freer, when Martin was around. It could have been nothing, Daniel told himself, yet nothing has a way of becoming something when patterns repeat often enough. For the townspeople, Martin was untouchable. His wealth shielded him from suspicion, and his good deeds painted him as a savior. He had donated new hymn books when the old ones wore thin. He had paid for the stained glass windows that bathed the sanctuary in colors each Sunday morning. He even bought the Hayes family a new car when their old one broke down, insisting it was only right that the pastor travel with dignity. These acts of kindness disguised something deeper, something no one dared to name. To question Martin's motives would be to bite the hand that had fed the church for years. Rebecca, meanwhile, became a frequent guest at Martin's mansion. At first, it was under the guise of planning events or discussing church finances. But the visits became more frequent, stretching late into the evenings. When asked, she explained that Martin trusted her with responsibilities Daniel was too busy to handle. No one challenged her. After all, she was the pastor's wife, a figure of respect, but beneath the surface, the town was watching, even if quietly. Whispers spread in hushed tones, suggestions that Rebecca seemed to glow differently after her meetings with Martin, that she carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Daniel noticed most of all. His prayers grew longer, his sermons sharper, as though he was fighting invisible demons only he could sense. He began to feel trapped in a web spun from gratitude and suspicion. Martin was the reason the church flourished, yet Martin was also the shadow that loomed over his marriage. How could he confront the man who gave him everything, the very man who owned the pulpit he preached from? What no one in Willow Creek understood at that time was that Martin's role in the Hayes household was more than financial support. He was weaving himself into the very fabric of their lives, a presence both welcomed and feared. Daniel could not escape him, Rebecca could not resist him, and the town could not see past his charm. The stage was being set quietly, carefully, for a storm no one would predict. Behind every donation, every smile, every handshake, Martin was drawing closer to Rebecca, and with each step he was pulling Daniel further into despair. It would not be long before the whispers grew louder, the suspicions harder to ignore, and the image of perfection surrounding the Hayes family began to fracture. What seemed like the blessing of a generous benefactor was, in truth, the seed of betrayal waiting to bloom. And when it did, the town would never look at its pastor, his wife, or the church owner in the same way again. Daniel Hayes had built his life on trust. Trust in God, trust in his church, and above all, trust in his wife. Yet the foundation he had depended on for years was beginning to show cracks he could no longer ignore. It started with small discoveries, things so ordinary they could have been mistakes. A receipt tucked between the pages of Rebecca's devotional book, another left carelessly in the pocket of her purse. At first he thought little of them, but the names and addresses written across the slips of paper gnawed at his mind. They weren't local restaurants or shops, they were hotel receipts, signed in Martin Cole's distinctive handwriting. The thought of Rebecca meeting Martin in secret made Daniel's chest tighten with an anger he struggled to suppress. Still, he tried to convince himself there must be another explanation. Martin was generous, yes, but perhaps too generous. Maybe he had paid for accommodations for someone else in the congregation. Perhaps Rebecca had simply been holding on to the receipts for record-keeping. These were the lies Daniel told himself late into the night, staring at the ceiling while his wife slept soundly beside him. But the evidence refused to stay hidden. A new dress appeared in Rebecca's closet without explanation. Perfume lingered on her skin, one Daniel knew he hadn't bought for her. She left the house with vague reasons. Meetings, errands, small tasks that stretched into hours. When Daniel asked, her answers came smoothly, without hesitation, almost rehearsed. He felt himself slipping into the role of a stranger in his own marriage, watching as Rebecca drifted further away from him while maintaining the perfect facade for the rest of the town. The betrayal cut deeper because of who Martin was. He wasn't just another man, he was the very backbone of the church Daniel devoted his life to. Every brick, every pew, every hymn book carried Martin's mark of ownership. Without his support, the church might not survive, and yet Daniel couldn't escape the suspicion that his wife, the woman who stood at his side each Sunday, was slipping into Martin's arms when no one was watching. The more he tried to pray the thoughts away, the darker they became. His faith, once steady and unwavering, began to falter. Standing at the pulpit, he felt the weight of hypocrisy pressing down on him. He preached about loyalty, about the sanctity of marriage, while in his own heart he doubted every word. Congregants noticed his sermons growing harsher, his tone sharper. They believed it was the weight of leadership, the stress of guiding so many souls. None guessed it was the poison of suspicion seeping through his veins. Rebecca, for her part, acted as though nothing had changed. Her smile was as bright as ever when greeting members of the congregation, her presence in the community just as steady. Yet Daniel began to notice moments when her eyes seemed distant, her thoughts elsewhere. She spoke of Martin casually, with the kind of ease that comes from familiarity, as if his name belonged naturally in their conversations. That ease, more than anything, unsettled Daniel. It was as though Martin's shadow had entered their home, filling every corner, suffocating him silently. Daniel's doubts grew until they consumed him. Every unanswered call, every late night, every unexplained absence became evident in his mind. He began to see betrayal in the smallest gestures, the way Rebecca fixed her hair before leaving, the glow on her cheeks when she returned. Each detail added weight to a suspicion that was turning into certainty, and with certainty came something far more dangerous than doubt, rage. By day, Daniel fought to maintain the image of the loving pastor. By night, he stared into the dark, imagining his wife with another man. He replayed the receipts in his mind. The perfume, the missing hours. Each piece of evidence struck like a hammer against the fragile shell of the life he had built. Slowly, he realized the truth he had been avoiding. Rebecca was not just slipping away from him. She was choosing someone else, and that someone was Martin Cole, the man who held the keys not only to the church, but perhaps to Rebecca's heart. What Daniel didn't know was that the discoveries he had made were only the beginning. The betrayal would not remain hidden forever. The cracks in his faith, in his marriage, and in his carefully built life were spreading quickly, and soon they would split wide open for the entire town to see. Sarah Mitchell had been part of the church long before Daniel ever arrived in Willow Creek. She was a trustee, the kind of woman who noticed things others overlooked. Quiet but loyal, she had always admired Daniel's devotion, and when she began to sense the tension between him and Rebecca, she paid closer attention. She saw what others ignored, the subtle distance in the Hayes household, the way Daniel's sermons carried a bitterness that hadn't been there before, the way Rebecca's attention seemed too often directed elsewhere. Sarah's instincts told her that something was unraveling beneath the perfect image the town believed in. When Daniel confided in her, revealing the hotel receipts and his growing suspicion, Sarah did not dismiss him. She knew that betrayal, once suspected, rarely came from nowhere. Instead of offering comforting words, she promised to watch, to gather what Daniel could not. In doing so, she stepped into a dangerous role, one that would pull her deeper into the darkness surrounding the Hayes family. Sarah's first discovery came on a cool evening, when she stayed late after a committee meeting at the church. She noticed Rebecca leaving in a hurry, far later than she usually did. Instead of heading home, Rebecca walked toward the parking lot where Martin's sleek black car waited. Sarah lingered in the shadows, her heart racing as she saw Rebecca slip inside. The sight was quick, almost casual, yet it burned into Sarah's memory. She didn't need proof on paper to understand what was happening. She had seen it with her own eyes. But Sarah did not tell Daniel immediately. She wanted to be certain, to gather more than one fleeting moment that could be explained away. Over the next weeks, she followed Rebecca discreetly. Sometimes it was to the edge of town, where Rebecca disappeared into Martin's private residence. Other times it was in broad daylight, where she noticed the two of them standing too close, speaking in low voices that carried an intimacy unfit for casual conversation. Each discovery tightened the knot of dread in Sarah's stomach. She knew Daniel would break when she told him, but she also knew he deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. When she finally revealed what she had seen, Daniel's reaction was not what she expected. He did not shout, did not break down. He grew silent, his face pale, his eyes distant. It was as though something inside him had cracked quietly, like glass splintering under pressure. Sarah left that night unsettled, sensing that Daniel's silence was not acceptance but something far more dangerous. From that point forward, Daniel began to change. He attended his duties as pastor, spoke his sermons, and greeted his congregation. But beneath the surface, his thoughts turned darker with each passing day. He prayed less and brooded more. His faith, once a guiding light, became overshadowed by an obsession he could not shake. He began to watch Rebecca closely, noticing every movement, every detail. His nights were restless, filled with thoughts not of forgiveness, but of vengeance. Sarah, though she had tried to help, now felt uneasy. She had given Daniel the truth, but in doing so she had lit a fire she could not control. She watched him grow colder, quieter, his eyes carrying a weight that frightened her. There were moments when she wished she had kept silent, moments when she realized that by uncovering Rebecca's betrayal, she had unleashed something far more dangerous than the affair itself. The cracks in Daniel's life were no longer invisible. They were spreading rapidly, threatening to break everything he had built. Yet no one else in Willow Creek saw it. To the town, he was still the same pastor, a little more stern perhaps, but still respected, still admired. Only Sarah knew that beneath the calm exterior, Daniel Hayes was slipping further into darkness, and with each passing day, the silence inside him was growing louder, heavier, and far more lethal. The stage was set, though no one yet realized it. Betrayal had been discovered, trust had been shattered, and vengeance was slowly taking root. The perfect couple of Willow Creek was teetering on the edge of disaster. And when the final moment arrived, it would come not with warning, but with sudden, irreversible violence. The night it happened began like any other, yet there was something heavy in the air that no one in Willow Creek could name. A storm was brewing over the small town, clouds pressing low, winds rattling the windows of houses that usually stood in quiet peace. In the parsonage, however, the storm had already settled inside. Daniel Hayes had spent the day in silence, moving from one room to another with the measured steps of a man trapped inside his own mind. His sermons, his prayers, his duties, all of them seemed meaningless now. The betrayal he had tried to suppress had consumed him fully. Rebecca left the house that evening, with a soft smile and a carefully chosen excuse. She mentioned a prayer meeting, a small gathering she claimed required her presence. Daniel nodded, saying nothing, but inside he knew. The lies had become too polished, too easy. Every word she spoke was like a blade pressed against his chest. He watched her walk out the door, her figure swallowed by the night, and he felt the fury rise like a tide that could no longer be held back. Hours dragged on in silence. The house felt cavernous, every tick of the clock echoing like a warning. Daniel paced the study, his eyes falling on the objects around him. Books, candles, the cross mounted on the wall. They should have given him comfort, but instead they reminded him of the hypocrisy festering in his own home. He had preached forgiveness countless times, urged others to turn the other cheek, but forgiveness now felt impossible. His wife had desecrated their vows, and the man she had chosen was the very one who owned the ground beneath his pulpit. Daniel's pride, his faith, his identity, all of it had been torn apart. When Rebecca finally returned, the storm outside had broken open. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder cracked above, and lightning illuminated the parsonage in sudden flashes of white. She entered quietly, shaking droplets from her coat, her movements casual, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Daniel watched her, his face hidden in the dim light of the study. She seemed startled to see him awake, but quickly covered it with a smile. He said nothing. His silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. It was in that silence that Daniel made his choice. On the desk beside him rested a heavy candlestick holder, its metal surface glinting faintly in the storm's light. He had seen it countless times before, but tonight it seemed different, purposeful, as though waiting for him. His hand closed around it, and the weight felt final. Rebecca stepped closer, unaware of what was coming, her guard lowered by years of trust in the man before her. The first strike was sudden, sharp and final. It echoed louder than the thunder outside, a sound that seemed to split not only the night but the very fabric of the life they had built. Rebecca collapsed, her body crumpling against the floor, the light in her eyes extinguished in an instant. The storm raged on outside, but inside the parsonage, an even darker storm had reached its violent conclusion. For a long time, Daniel stood over her, the candlestick slipping from his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done sank into his bones, cold and suffocating. The woman who had once been his partner, his love, his pride, now lay lifeless at his feet. He had taken from himself the very thing he had once sworn to protect. There was no going back. When the body was discovered hours later, horror swept through Willow Creek. The townspeople gathered outside the parsonage, their whispers carried by the storm's dying winds. At first suspicion fell on Martin, for everyone knew of his closeness to Rebecca. It seemed plausible, even expected, that the affair had ended in violence. But investigators soon looked deeper. The scene told a different story, one of rage within the home, not outside it. The candlestick was found in the basement, hurriedly hidden, still marked with blood. Daniel tried to maintain his composure, but his grief and guilt betrayed him. His words stumbled, his explanations faltered, and his eyes gave away what his lips refused to admit. The evidence closed in quickly, each piece fitting too neatly to ignore. The pastor who had once been admired for his unwavering faith, now stood as the prime suspect in his wife's brutal death. The storm outside finally cleared by morning, leaving Willow Creek quiet once again. But nothing in the town would ever feel the same. The parsonage was no longer a place of peace, but a house of death. And Daniel Hayes was no longer the voice of God, but a man driven by vengeance. The night of judgment had come, and it had claimed not only Rebecca's life but Daniel's soul. The news spread through Willow Creek with a speed and force no one expected. By dawn, the parsonage was surrounded by police cars, flashing lights cutting across the quiet streets that had always felt so safe. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, their voices trembling as they tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Rebecca Hayes, the pastor's wife, the woman they had admired for her grace and kindness, was dead. And worse still, suspicion was not directed at a stranger or an intruder, but at the very man who had led them in prayer for years. At first, the whispers turned toward Martin Cole. To many, it seemed obvious. His wealth, his closeness to Rebecca, his habit of keeping her company long after services had ended. It all fit the shape of scandal and murder. Some even believed he had acted in a jealous rage, or perhaps silenced her to protect their secret. But investigators quickly shifted their attention. The crime scene told a different story, one that didn't match the image of a hidden lover sneaking through the night. The signs of struggle were contained within the study, and there was no evidence of forced entry. Rebecca had died in her own home, and all traces pointed back to Daniel. The discovery of the candlestick sealed his fate. Found in the basement behind a stack of old hymnals, it carried the unmistakable stain of blood. It was not the weapon of a man breaking in. It was the weapon of someone who lived there, who had snapped in a moment of rage. Forensic tests confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The pastor's calm facade began to crumble, his attempts at denial sounding weak and hollow against the growing weight of evidence. The trial became the most talked-about event Willow Creek had ever seen. Reporters descended on the small town, cameras flashing outside the courthouse where Daniel Hayes was brought in shackled and pale. The man who once stood tall behind a pulpit now appeared diminished, his eyes darkened with sleepless nights, his hands trembling as he faced the world's judgment. Inside the courtroom, the details spilled out with chilling clarity. The receipts Daniel had found, the perfume that didn't belong to him, the hours Rebecca spent with Martin, all of it painted a picture of betrayal that drove a man of God to murder. Sarah Mitchell was called to testify, her voice steady but heavy with guilt. She spoke of the nights she followed Rebecca, of the meetings at Martin's residence, of the secrets she uncovered and shared with Daniel. Her testimony revealed not only the affair but also the depth of Daniel's obsession once he knew the truth. She described his silence, the coldness that began to settle over him, the way he carried himself like a man waiting for something inevitable. Her words struck the jury hard, leaving no doubt that this was not a random act of violence but the culmination of a storm building quietly for months. Martin Cole himself took the stand, denying everything. He admitted to generosity, admitted to closeness, but flatly refused to acknowledge any affair. His wealth and influence shielded him, and though many in town whispered that he was lying, there was no solid evidence to prove otherwise. The trial was not about Martin, it was about Daniel. And in the end it was Daniel who bore the full weight of judgment. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once beloved pastor lowered his head, his shoulders slumping as though the word itself had crushed him. Some in the gallery wept, not only for Rebecca but for the man they had trusted, the man who had guided their faith. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the image of their pastor with the reality of a murderer. Willow Creek would never recover fully. The church doors reopened, but the pews felt emptier, the air heavier. Every sermon delivered by a new voice carried the echo of the man who once stood there, his memory forever tainted by blood. The parsonage remained a place of unease, its windows dark, its walls whispering of the night a storm both outside and within brought ruin to a family. Daniel Hayes became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those who seemed most righteous could fall into shadows darker than anyone imagined. Rebecca's grave was visited often, flowers left by those who still couldn't believe how her story ended, and Martin, though untouched by the law, carried the stain of suspicion wherever he went, whispers following him like a shadow he could never escape. In the end, the tragedy of Willow Creek was not just that a woman had been killed, but that the man who had once stood as a symbol of faith and love had revealed himself capable of the darkest sin. It left behind a community scarred, a legacy shattered, and a haunting question that lingered long after the trial was over. How well can anyone ever truly know the people they trust the most?